The Dispenser of Holy Water. Once upon a time, just outside a small village, there lived a man who had a modest house by the road. He was a wheelwright by trade and had married a local farmer's daughter. Both he and his wife were hard-working, and together they saved a decent amount of money over the years. However, one thing brought them great sorrow: they were unable to have children. After many years of waiting, they were finally blessed with a son, whom they named Jean. The couple adored their child, showering him with love and attention, never wanting him to be far from their sight. When Jean turned 5, a group of traveling entertainers came to the village and set up camp in the town square. The boy, drawn by their lively shows and colorful animals, managed to sneak out of the house. His father searched frantically for him and, after hours of looking, found Jean laughing with joy, sitting on the lap of an old clown, completely captivated by the performing dogs and goats. 3 days later, as the family was sitting down for dinner, they noticed Jean wasn't around. They assumed he was playing in the garden, but when they went out to call him, there was no response. His father grew concerned and ventured out into the road, calling out, "Jean!" repeatedly. Night began to fall, and the fog made everything look eerie and distant. The tall trees nearby seemed to sway in a mournful rhythm, and the only sound was the wind, as if the world itself was sighing. Still, there was no answer. Desperate and terrified, the father wandered through the night, shouting his son's name over and over, until exhaustion took over. His wife, sobbing uncontrollably, waited for him on the doorstep until morning. They never found Jean. In the days that followed, grief weighed heavily on them. Their once happy life felt empty, and they grew older quickly. Eventually, the couple decided to sell their home and set off to find their boy, hoping that somehow, somewhere, they might come across him. They wandered from village to village, asking anyone they met, shepherds, travelers, merchants, if they had seen a little boy matching Jean's description. But so much time had passed, and people only shook their heads. It seemed their son had been gone too long to be remembered, and over the years, he had likely forgotten even his own name. The parents' hope faded, and they wept silently as they continued their search. After a while, their savings ran out. They were forced to work on farms and in inns, doing whatever odd jobs they could find, anything just to get by. They slept wherever they could, often on the cold ground, surviving on scraps of food given to them by strangers. As their bodies grew weaker from the hard labor, fewer people wanted to hire them, and eventually, they found themselves begging along the roads for food. One day, while telling their story to an innkeeper, they were given a glimmer of hope. "I once knew someone who found their lost daughter in Paris," the innkeeper said. Clinging to this idea, the couple set out for the capital. Arriving in Paris, they were overwhelmed by the sheer size of the city and the crowds of people. But even in this vast metropolis, they believed their son must be out there somewhere. The problem was, they didn't know how to begin their search or even if they would recognize him after all this time. He had been so young when they last saw him. They wandered the streets aimlessly, hoping for some miraculous encounter or lucky break. The bustling crowds seemed full of strangers, and they were lost in a sea of faces. Every Sunday, they stood outside the churches, watching the congregations, hoping to spot a face that looked familiar. Occasionally, they thought they saw someone who resembled Jean, but each time they were wrong. During one of these visits to a church, they met an old man who was the dispenser of holy water. He, too, had a sad story, and the three of them formed a bond of friendship. They began living together in a poor, small apartment at the edge of the city, far from the busy streets. The husband occasionally helped the old dispenser when he was too ill to work. That winter was particularly harsh, and the old dispenser's health declined. He passed away, and the parish priest, moved by the couple's tragic tale, offered the father the position of dispenser. Now every day, the man sat at the church entrance in the same spot, leaning against a worn stone pillar. He watched everyone who came in, waiting for Sundays with eager anticipation, as those were the days when the church was busiest. Over the years, he had grown old and frail. His energy dwindled, as did his hope. He had come to recognize the regular worshippers and knew their habits so well that he could even tell who was approaching by the sound of their footsteps. His world had shrunk to the confines of the church, and the entrance of a new face became a major event for him. One Sunday, two women entered the church, one older and one younger, possibly a mother and daughter. Following them was a man, who bowed courteously as he walked behind them. As the couple left, the man offered holy water to the older woman before taking her arm to escort her out. The dispenser was struck by a faint sense of familiarity. Where had he seen this man before? He pondered over it all day. The resemblance stirred a distant memory, but he couldn't quite place it. The man seemed to remind him of someone from his youth, back in his hometown. But that person, he thought, must be old now like him. The mysterious man returned to the church several more times, each time walking the two women home. The dispenser grew obsessed with this vague resemblance and asked his wife to come with him to the church to see if she could help him remember. One evening, as darkness began to fall, the same trio entered the church. As they passed by, the old man anxiously asked his wife, "Do you recognize him?" She squinted, trying to recall. Then, in a hushed voice, she exclaimed, "Yes, yes, but he's darker now, taller, broader. And he dresses like a gentleman. But, my dear, it's your face from when you were young." The old man was startled. It was true. The man resembled him in his younger years, and also his brother who had passed away. The couple stood in stunned silence, barely able to speak, their hearts pounding with anticipation. As the strangers were about to leave, the man touched the holy water sprinkler. The old dispenser, his hands trembling, sprinkled the ground as he whispered, "Jean." The young man stopped in his tracks and turned around. Again, in a softer voice, the dispenser said, "Jean." The two women looked on, puzzled by the exchange. The young man bent down, staring closely at the old man's face. A flicker of recognition passed over him. The dispenser uttered the name a third time, choking on his sobs, "Jean." And in that moment, the man's childhood memories rushed back. "Papa Pierre, Mama Jean," he cried, as he fell to his knees and buried his face in the old man's lap, sobbing uncontrollably. He kissed his father and mother, overcome with emotion. The two women, now understanding what had happened, also began to cry, moved by the extraordinary reunion. The family spent that night together at Jean's house, where he explained his story. After the circus people had taken him, he traveled with them for several years. Eventually, the troupe broke up, and an elderly woman, charmed by his appearance, took him in. She raised him as her own and provided him with an education. She passed away, leaving him her entire fortune, but despite his efforts, Jean could never find his parents, as he could only remember the names Papa Pierre and Mama Jean. Jean was now engaged to be married, and he introduced his fiancée to his parents, a kind, beautiful young woman. The elderly couple shared their own story of heartbreak and perseverance. That night, they all stayed up late, too afraid to sleep, lest their newfound happiness slip away like a dream. But their suffering had finally ended. The family was whole again, and they would never be separated for the rest of their lives.
Thank you for listening. Like, subscribe, and share our channel Magic Mingle with your friends to enjoy more magical stories.